Today, as part of our ongoing The Gotei 13 series, where each month we take a look at one of the divisions that helps to make up Soul Society's military might, we'll be taking a look at a division that, at least in my opinion, is somewhat underrated among the 13. A division that is melancholy, gloomy, and full of despair, but at the same time has something of a flair for the theatrical, being of course the 3rd division. And just like the other videos in this series so far, we're going to be doing a deep dive overview of the 3rd division as a whole, as well as taking a look at the division's role in the overarching Bleach story, and then breaking down some of the division's more famous and prominent names and faces. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now, as you're in the perfect place for Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up as well to really show it your support. It really does help, especially at the moment. It just means that the video gets more exposure on the whole YouTube algorithm, and it just means that more Bleach fans like yourselves get a chance to see it and partake in the discussion. If you want to take that support from me another step further, we do have a Patreon for the channel as well now, where you can get videos like this one early. You can support me over there for as little as $1 a month, and an enormous shout out goes out to everyone who is supporting me over there on Patreon and helping me do what I love, which is bringing you Bleach content like this every single week. So thank you so much. So then, the 3rd division. Now, I actually quite like these guys, and I like their vibe, despite mentioning earlier that I think they are somewhat underrated when looked at as part of the wider Bleach universe. I think they are quite an emotional division. I think they wear their emotions on their sleeves a lot of the time, and this means they come across as being quite bleak, quite dreary, maybe even somewhat edgy, although I appreciate that they kind of grab that by the horns and run with it. You know, their current captain, Rose, who's actually one of my favourite captains out of the lot of them, you know, he's always playing his electric guitar while talking about how the lyrics are his emotions kind of coming crying out of him, and how his guitar is crying with the deaths of his men. And his vice captain, Izuru Kira, is this perpetually depressed character who beheads his enemies and then asks them not to forgive him. It's like this whole very cloudy, very heavy division, but there is that air of theatricality to it as well, which I do really enjoy. And I feel like it's a bit of a shame that we just don't get to see more of these guys. And when I say they're underrated, that comes from a position of each of the different divisions having a certain amount of relevance in the story of Bleach. And the 3rd division is a weird one. It's a really weird one because it starts off having a decent amount of relevance, as you'll see when we get into the story itself. With Gin Ichimaru as the captain and one of the premier villains of the story for the first half, it thrust the 3rd division into the spotlight. And then after when the second half of the story begins, the 3rd division slips into almost complete obscurity. And I think that's a real massive shame. And, you know, that comes from a cocktail of various circumstances. Gin dying, Izuru being almost obliterated at the start of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and Rose just getting virtually no screen time at all. All of this combines into a division that is barely even thought of going into the second half of the series, and that's a huge shame, because I think there's so much potential here. And as I mentioned before, the 3rd division is something of a melancholy division, and this is very deep-rooted. You know, it's even found in the division's insignia, which is the marigold flower, which, as Kira says, symbolises despair, but at the same time also symbolises their pride and strength within their division. And the marigold is actually a very interesting flower for this division to have, and just really shows how much effort and care Kubo puts into the smallest of details when crafting his divisions. Because the marigold flower, thanks to its shape, its vibrancy, its colour, is often known as the herb of the sun, and because of that, is often synonymous with feelings of happiness, joy, and warmth, which you would not expect from the 3rd division at all. In fact, thanks to the way many of the 3rd division members seem to act, or at least the most prominent ones anyway, you might get the impression it's something of a cold, alienating division, maybe a little bit weird, a little bit out there that people find maybe difficult to socialise with. And the marigold has an extra layer of meaning that I think fits this division perfectly. Alongside those slightly happier, more optimistic emotions, the Marigold can also convey darker emotions as well, such as jealousy, grief, but most importantly, despair, and the type of despair that is found when you have lost a love through either maybe death or, most importantly for this division, a broken relationship. As of course, Gin's actions in the Soul Society arc and the events that would follow seem to shape this division for the rest of the story. Certainly those actions have a lasting impact on the Vice Captain, who ironically is probably the most prominent face of the third division throughout the start to the finish of the series, Izuru Kira, who becomes completely depressed, introverted, insular, and a changed man after the events of the Soul Society arc, which then seem to reflect outwards on the rest of the division. The division's official colour is spring green, or a kind of mint green, which again I think is quite interesting. Doing a little bit of research into this, the colour seems to mean tranquility and sort of creativity as well. And more than anything, these traits seem to apply mostly to the division's former and then current captain, Rose, who we mentioned earlier, who is a very sort of creative, very musical individual, again quite emotional, and I think that colour seems to fit him perfectly. And Rose is an interesting character because his traits in the Urankar arc, where he's not actually a member of the third division, seem to be mostly about waxing lyrical, about the bonds of friendship and about his music and art forms and everything like that. And he brings most of that with him into the final arc as well. But in the final arc, he certainly seems to take on many of the traits that come with the third division as well, almost like baggage, which we can get into in a bit. The third division, again, has no special duties to call their own, and their barracks aren't really seen all that often. You get to briefly glimpse them during the Hitsugaya versus Gin fight in the Soul Society arc, as that takes place in the third division's barracks. But it's also known that Gin planted a persimmon tree there as well, which he would then use to create dishes to distribute among the rest of the divisions, which is a nice little detail, again, about a character who is so often seen as being a snake-like villain that so many characters are predisposed to disliking. It's nice to know that he was just kind of doing his own thing, and apparently, you know, it's said through numerous accounts in the Bleach bootleg and supplementary materials as well, that Gin in particular was very much known for just doing his own thing, being a little bit mischievous, but at the same time, his subordinates seemed to like him regardless. So I think the kind of vibe of the third division while Gin was in charge was that you maybe didn't necessarily know what they were up to. They might have been up to some mischief, but they were mostly well-intentioned. And so we come to the third division's role in the story, and as I mentioned, it starts out pretty strong for these guys before just kind of careening off a cliff in terms of relevancy, which is very sad for me to see, because like I said, I do like this division. I really do like the captain, even though he's treated pretty horribly throughout the Thousand Year Blood War arc in particular. But the earliest kind of moment we know of the third division is 110 years ago in the Turnabout the Pendulum arc, as it is with so many of these divisions, where it's actually revealed that Rose was only recently promoted to the role of captain, 2 years prior in fact, so a total of 112 years before the main storyline. Now, although this is never shown in the manga itself, Rose's vice captain is in fact the mother of Tetsuzaimon Iba, Chikane Iba, which is a question I recently put out on the community post, and the majority of people didn't quite manage to get that one, so I thought that was quite interesting to see. But I also really don't blame you, because Chikane Iba was only ever seen in one image, which I believe was, again, part of one of these supplementary material books, which is an awesome picture showcasing basically the full spread of the Gotei 13 from 110 years ago, and she's there with Rose. Really cool to see, but that's literally all you get of her. Although it's nice to know that I think she was kind of bossing Rose around. You can maybe assume, this is total speculation, that Chikane Iba had been a part of the third division, or at least the high-ranking officers of the third division, longer than Rose had, and so she maybe felt like she was in charge and pushed him around a bit, because Rose is, I would imagine, a bit of a pushover, at least in his early days. And interestingly, we don't know anything really about life in the third division prior to Rose taking over, but Kyoraku does mention that the third division's captain actually retired prior to Rose taking over, which is very, very unusual in the Soul Society. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Very unusual. Those kind of circumstances don't seem to come around too often, but it's nice to get that little tidbit of information regardless. And Rose, like the rest of the Vizards, or the soon-to-be Vizards anyway, is sent to the site of Aizen's holification experiments, where he does battle with the holified Kensei and Mashiro. Unfortunately for Rose, before he can really partake, he is kicked in the back of the head by the holified Mashiro, signifying her entrance into the battle. But he's not out of the game completely, as he does use a Kido Blast to strike Kensei to prevent him from attacking one of his comrades, basically saying, the Kensei I know would never have attacked somebody like this that he cared about. And that's a nice little moment for Rose. Those moments for Rose, you have to kind of grab them when you can, because he doesn't get many of them. So, those moments in the spotlight are nice to see. But unfortunately, as we know, the tragedy of this night is that all of these Shinigami involved in this holification mess, apart from, of course, the perpetrators, one of them, including, would be Gin Ichimaru, would then be exiled to Karakura Town, where they would no longer hold the positions they once did. And so we don't really know the trajectory of the 3rd Division for a little while. We know that Gin Ichimaru becomes the captain at some point, but not immediately after, because once Aizen is the captain of the 5th Division, Gin is his lieutenant for a little while, and we see Gin grow up significantly from the small boy he was in Turn Back the Pendulum to essentially looking like normal adult Gin while still a vice captain. So my personal guess is that Gin becomes a captain not too long before Everything But the Rain. Everything But the Rain taking place 20 years prior to the main storyline. Gin is now the captain of the 3rd Division. So I'm thinking he's not been a captain for that long prior to that flashback. And really, it's the Soul Society arc that is Squad 3's kind of crowning moment in the story. They play an unusual but large role in the story, where they are kind of the villains of the arc, or at least the secondary bad guys, the ones who are shifty and up to no good behind the scenes. If Byakuya Kuchiki is kind of the primary antagonist of the Soul Society arc, Gin Ichimaru is concocting some kind of sinister scheme in the background, or at least you're supposed to think he is anyway. But Gin, and so by proxy, the 3rd Division acts as that kind of scapegoat bad guy for the entire first arc, the first main arc. But because of that, he gets some cool moments. Like I said, he gets to fight Hitsugaya in the 3rd Division barracks. He gets the first meeting with Ichigo out of all the captains outside of Byakuya, and because of that, he becomes a really prominent and very popular with the fans character, and that thrusts the Squad 3 into the limelight. And we've mentioned this many times before. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Gin, because we've spoken about him a lot on the channel, even recently, but so much of Gin's actions seem to put Kira into harm's way. He's manipulating his vice captain into helping him and helping Aizen without giving Izuru really any indication of what's actually going on. And because of this, Izuru turns his sword against his childhood friend Hinamori. He ends up going to prison, where you actually see it looks like he's even hurting himself, because he thinks he's so despicable for turning his sword against Momo. And Gin is driving this. Gin turns up to Kira's prison cell, and he's like, "Oh, you poor thing, what have you done to yourself?" All the while with that mocking fox-like grin. And he's like, "Why don't I bust you out of there?" And that's kind of interesting, because it's so obviously illegal, but Kira kind of goes along with it. Maybe he didn't really have a choice, but it is also known that Kira did have quite a great respect for Gin, so much so that he seems to blindly follow his orders, even if they've already gotten him into trouble once before. But it's really not hard to see how all of these events kind of coalesce to plunge Kira into a pit of despair. He's been used as a pawn of both Gin and Aizen right up until the very end of the Soul Society arc, where Gin kind of enlists him to slow down Hitsugaya and Rangiku. I've always found this scene to be really weird, because Kira must know something is wrong. He must realise his captain is up to absolutely no good, because he's having to turn his sword again against someone else he's friends with, this time being Matsumoto, but he seems to just go along with it regardless, and Matsumoto is even well aware that Gin has manipulated him. And once the truth comes out about Gin, about the fact that Aizen has nearly killed Hinamori, again, Izuru seems beside himself about the fact that Gin has allowed Hinamori to be hurt despite supposedly promising Kira that she wouldn't be. And you just have to kind of think, like, where is your head in all this? Like, how are you thinking Gin is up to anything other than something against the Soul Society, and yet Kira's just going along with it, attacking Rangiku in a short fight where he reveals the powers of his Wabisuke, and it does feel a little out of character for Kira when you see how he acts after this, moving forwards. But I think the point is that he is just mentally in a very bad, very dark place, and his captain is preying on that. But after all this plays out and Gin flees the Soul Society, Squad 3 is left without a captain for some time now, the entirety of the Arrancar arc. Again, this is what I mean when Kira kind of steps forward as the main face of this division, but he is not really seen at all until the fake Karakura Town fight, where he shows up with 4 other fighters, roughly vice captain level, being Hisagi, Ikaku, and Yumichika, to help defend the pillars of the fake Karakura Town. You get a nice fight with Izuru against Baragon's Fraction Avirama Redder, where he's kind of showing off his new world view, I guess. The innocence of Izuru Kira is long dead. The betrayal of his captain has left him kind of a broken man, a shell of who he once was. You get those shots of Kira in the Shinigami Academy. He's a much happier, much brighter man with a really positive outlook on life, and the person we see now is a shadowy, gloomy individual he beheads Avirama at the end of their fight, and he's like, war is supposed to be a horrific thing. It's not supposed to be something you take pride in. It's not supposed to be something that you get pumped up for. And he kind of embodies, he's a living embodiment at this point of the Marigold, of the 3rd Division's beliefs in despair and darkness. And there's that great moment where, from the flames, Gin says, he's glad that Kira is doing well. Basically, I feel like it is a facetious remark. It's really difficult to know because Gin is supposed to be very unreadable. And this is just after Izuru has attacked Avirama for saying Gin's name. It's a very touchy subject for Kira. Kira's a really fascinating character. I'm looking forward to talking about him more in greater detail. But Kira's role in the fake Karakura Town arc continues on beyond his initial fight against the Fraction. He takes something of an active role in the battle, mostly aiding his comrades as they fall, providing healing, as he was originally part of the 4th Division as well at one point. And so you see him helping the gravely injured Matsumoto, helping out people like Hinamori as the battle with Ion rages on. And Kira is interesting in the fake Karakura Town because of all the vice captains, because he doesn't really get taken out of the battle, he provides almost like sort of like a reader's avatar during the fight. He's kind of watching the fight with Ion go to hell as Ion is beating everyone up, and he's like, he's there. The reader feels that same tension he does as Ion closes in. The reader feels that same relief that he does as Yamamoto arrives to save him. And this extends later on as well, as the scene just seems to grow worse and worse for the Gotei. Kira begs Komamura to join the fight. Kira watches as Aizen is freed from Jokaku Enjo and proclaims the whole fight is probably lost. And he's just a really interesting perspective to have on the battlefield. Much later, Kira is cut down by Aizen alongside Iba after Aizen's treachery is revealed and Momo is nearly killed. And that basically takes Kira out of the Arrancar arc, though he does show up again very briefly just to kind of shout to Matsumoto about getting her to stop running because she's nearly dead. Now, when Hisagi killed Tozen, a lot of people, probably quite rightly, anticipated that Kira might have something to do with bringing down Gin eventually. But really, Kira doesn't have anything to do with it at all and is mostly left on the wayside for the rest of the arc. And it's kind of strange to think about it like this, but with the Arrancar arc coming to a close, this is the end of the 3rd Division's relevancy in the story in really any kind of capacity. Gin is, of course, killed at the end of the Urankar arc, which is a seismic blow to the third squad's kind of, relevancy in the story. In the Lost Agent arc, there is a nice bit of transition where Rose is reappointed captain of the 3rd Division and helps Ichigo restore his Shinigami powers. That's really nice to see. And then when the 1,000-Year Blood War arc comes around, Kira is still the vice captain of the division, he's taking part in the meetings, but Kira is taken out of the story almost immediately. Kira is chosen to be the unlucky, to have the dubious honour of being absolutely annihilated to help showcase the power of the Vandenreich. Kira takes part in one vice captain meeting, then the Quincy attack Soul Society, and Kira, with the rest of Squad 3, basically kind of orders them to face off against their invader before getting blasted by what I presume is an arrow, and losing like an entire chunk of his body, his arm, most of his inner chest is gone, and we all kind of assume that Kira was probably dead at this point, as he kind of just collapses to the ground. Now, in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, at the very start, in the first Quincy invasion, a couple of Sternritter kind of approach each division, and the 2 Sternritter that attack Squad 3 are Sternritter H. Basby, who is the one who just wipes out Kira and more, which we'll get into, and Sternritter U. Nanana Najakoop, who goes and faces Rose himself. And it's a real shame that Kira is obliterated by this, because unlike Shinji and Momo and Kensei and Hisagi, these two never interact on screen, and that's a real shame, because it means that their relationship doesn't mean as much to us, as it doesn't get any chance to grow or develop whatsoever. And that's a real shame, because Kira is so devastated by what Gin does on an emotional level, that it would be so nice to see how he has grown and if he's accepted Rose into the fold. And I think that would be really fascinating. Hisagi, in many ways, is kind of not necessarily more emotionally mature, but he's able to kind of deal with Tozen's betrayal on a different level to Kira. He fully kind of embraces leadership of his division and even takes out his former captain. Whereas I think if Kira was presented with that opportunity, I'm not sure he would be able to go through with it. And so that's why, to me, it would have been so interesting to see him maybe accepting Rose, maybe not. It's hard to say. But Rose, for his credit, does say that whenever he was around Izuru, melodies would kind of flow out of his guitar, because his emotions were just kind of so free, and he felt so emotional around Kira, so supposedly highlighting that they did have a good bond, I assume, unless it was not reciprocated. But he says, if Izuru is dead, me and my flying V will cry. Now, as kind of like cheesy and, as I said before, edgy as this scene is, this is basically the coolest Rose scene in the series. I just love this scene where he says to Nanana, that my flying V and I are already crying. No guitar wouldn't cry over the bodies of so many dead men. You won't leave this place alive, Quincy. But unfortunately, that's about the best thing Rose does in the arc, because he's pretty much never seen again. So the 3rd Division hasn't got a great tally in the final arc. Kira's already been annihilated about 10 chapters in, and Rose only shows up sporadically. The next time you see him in a real capacity, he gets obliterated by Masked Masculine after explaining how his Bankai works, only to then be killed by Gremmy, resurrected by Giselle, and have his corpse paraded around as a zombie to be used against his comrades, before having his zombified body taken back by Mayuri. Now, I kind of wish that Kubo just handled this a little bit differently. Like, when Mayuri is able to take over Rose and Kensei, I just kind of wish he'd written into it somehow that they just return to their normal selves then and there, so they could have had some kind of expanded role. But after this kind of zombie skirmish, Rose is literally not seen again until the very end of the series, where it's revealed he survived and was de-zombified back to his normal self. And that's a big shame. Of course, Kira isn't actually dead. He returns right at the end of the Varvel arc, essentially, to help dispatch of Lil Barrow's weird flamingo forms, and we get to see that he was restored by Mayuri. The big chunk that was missing out of his body is now replaced by several bars, and essentially the kind of what I think is supposed to take away from this is that Kira is now like an undead version of himself, much in the same way as Rose is. Different degrees of that, of course, but this is now supposed to be the inner darkness that Izuru has had since the Irankar arc is now on the outside as well, and this is personified even further in the Hell chapter too. And then when we get to the Hell chapter, we do see both of these guys. Once again, they don't interact with each other, so we really have no concrete idea of how they are functioning as captain and vice captain. The 3rd division still feeling quite obscure in comparison to many of the others. Kira, however, now sporting a really awesome new look, one of my favourite new looks out of all the characters, and again, solidifying that idea that he is this kind of reclusive but like dark and edgy character who now has a hood. I think he looks really cool, to be fair, in an unironic way, but it is again kind of emphasising that dark despair, gloomy vibe that this division has, and Rose has more frills than ever. You know, he's got that theatricality to him that makes up the other half of the division. But it's nice that they're both alive, both functioning as high-ranking officers. It's just a shame they never really share any moments together whatsoever. And that's really it for the 3rd division's role in the Bleach storyline. And when it comes to the prominent characters of this division, well, I think we've kind of gone over the main trio quite extensively already. There was an awful lot to say about Kira that I just kind of went on and on about it in the role of the squad. But there are some other characters that we get to see very, very briefly. We actually get to see most of the 3rd division's kind of upper management, essentially. We get to see their 3rd, 5th, and 6th seat as well. Now, their 3rd seat, Riku, is actually a character that we've seen very briefly before. All 3 of these characters are showcased in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, but Riku actually shows up first in chapter 85, back when most of the Shinigami, I think, kind of noticed the arrival of the Ryoka when Ichigo and his gang are trying to save Rukia. And what I'm kind of assuming is going on here is most likely Kubo wanted some names to kill off in the Quincy invasion, went back through the arcs of Bleach, scoured the ranks of the kind of nameless Shinigami and picked out people he thought looked pretty good. And Riku does have a pretty unique design, so it's cool to see him brought back here for this moment. He's joined by Taketsuna Gori, who is the 5th seat, and Asuka Katakura, who is the 6th seat of the division as well. And there was a lot of this in the first Quincy invasion. A lot of Kubo basically just creating named Shinigami out of nowhere just to then kill them off, so that we would kind of, I guess, there would be a little bit more emotion rather than just getting swaths of redcoats taken out. You would instead have named characters who admittedly haven't been around for very long, but it has a little bit more of a gut punch than just nobody's getting killed off. Other examples of this are Hidetomo Kajimaru from the 13th Division, who is introduced in the story about 3 chapters prior to the first invasion, and then promptly killed off by Hashwolf, and also Genshiro Okikiba, who actually miraculously manages to survive the war with the Quincy. But these 3 Shinigami are there with Kira at the start of the invasion when Basby arrives in front of all of them, and they witness Kira get taken out of the fight, and they instantly activate their Zanpakuto. It's honestly a pretty good scene, and it's cool as well that their Zanpakuto all kind of correspond to a different season. Like, Riku kind of summons this massive scythe, and I believe its name has something to do with spring wind. Taketsuna, the last 2, the 5th and the 6th seat Zanpakutos are very hard to see properly. But his Zanpakuto's name has something to do with autumn, I believe, or even winter winds. And then Asuka's Zanpakuto has something to do with summer shade, like trying to find the shade in the heat of summer. That's a really nice little detail. But The 5th and the 6th seat are instantly killed by Bazby in what's actually pretty gruesome. He just kind of flies forward, grabs their faces, and smashes them into the floor of Soul Society, their heads kind of exploding. And back in the day, a lot of people thought it was kind of cheap of Kubo to give these guys names mere pages before their deaths. And I do kind of agree. I think it maybe would have been better to have created characters organically earlier on in the story. That being said, I do think the intended feeling comes across. When you see so many regular Shinigami getting butchered page by page, you kind of, it doesn't really mean anything because they could just be another walking Shihakusho. But when you've had even precious panels with these guys, they have original unique designs. Taketsu Nagori doesn't really look like anyone in the series, neither does Riku. Asuka kind of looks like your typical Bleach dude, similar to someone like Byakuya or something like that, but the other two are quite unique. And so seeing them banter back and forth, converse, fight alongside Riku and watch Kira fall only to be instantly killed themselves, it does strike home a little harder than it would have done otherwise. So I'm all for it. And then Riku gets basically, looks like his head cut off or something. It's pretty dark again, seeing him fall like that. But what's crazy about that is, in a matter of seconds, the 3rd Division's upper management is almost completely obliterated. The vice captain is essentially killed, although he's not. The 3rd seat is killed, the 5th seat is killed, the 6th seat is killed. And I think that was done, of course, to just really ramp up the stakes. The Vandenreich are not messing around. A division has just effectively been destroyed, and the same thing happens to the 1st Division as well, so that's kind of crazy. The difference is, you don't ever really feel the effects of these guys dying. They're never mentioned again. They're never brought up again. And the division, by the end of the story, is just kind of in the same place it was at the start of the Thousand Year Blood War anyway. So that's maybe a bit of a shame, but regardless, like I said, it's cool to see these guys. It's cool to even briefly get to know them, and then they're just kind of used as fodder when the battle comes. And one thing I want to mention very briefly as well is in the supplementary book Bleach Bootleg, they kind of do a fun little thing where each division has like a recruitment brochure. And I just wanted to bring up the 3rd Divisions in particular because I think it's quite an interesting one that gives a real insight into how Izuru is feeling. It basically says, what do you want of new recruits? What do you ask of them? What do you expect of them? That sort of thing. And Izuru's responses are almost universally, he just doesn't want them to be people who lie. And this is after Gin has betrayed him and left. And so Izuru's left to sort of pick up the pieces of the shattered division. And he's like, I just don't want people who lie. And he's like, well, and they're like, what's the vibe of the division? And he says, yeah, I've been wondering that myself for a little while now. I don't really know. And then he says something like, I don't really care who joins. Whoever joins, Captain Ichimaru won't be here anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So you can understand, I think Izuru is a fascinating insight into what happens to the people left behind. Like I said, Hisagi just kind of gets on with it. He just trucks on regardless. And Hinamori is like incapacitated for the majority of the time after Aizen's betrayal. But Izuru bears that brunt. And I think that's fascinating. I'm looking forward to talking about him in particular in more detail in the future. Alright guys, but that's it really for our in-depth look at the 3rd Division. I hope you enjoyed it. What do you think of this division? Do you think they're underrated like I do? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to get your opinion on this as well. Let me know who your favourite member of the 3rd Division is too. Mine is probably Rose. It always feels really ridiculous to say that because he does nothing really in the series, but I love his design, I love his Zanpakuto, all that sort of thing. It's just so good. But like I said at the start of the video, the general vibe of this division is one that I really enjoy overall. So I'd be more than happy to see more from the 3rd Division moving forward. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.